Good afternoon, everyone. Happy post 4th of July. I hope everyone had a great long weekend. And as the years have always done in the past with Master Supplements, we're on to another month and we're on to another topic. This is the trifecta, the finished result of our Through the Ages series. We're going to start with quick little refresh, and then we're going to get down into the details of life in the 60s and up. And before I want to get to that, I recently wrote an article that was shared on the Master Supplements US Enzymes blog. And when doing research for that article, I realized that the statistics on chronic disease are a lot worse than I thought. They're saying that roughly 80% of people nowadays over a certain age demographic, call it 65 or 70 plus, have at least one chronic condition. And beyond that, it's something like 60 or 65% have two or more. So if you know five people that are over the age of 65, four of them likely have some sort of chronic problem. Three of them have two or more chronic problems. If you use population-based evidence of just knowing five people in a certain demographic, that is a terrifying prospect. And today I really want to try to do my best to demystify the nature of chronic disease. What I mean by demystify is shift perspective from chasing symptoms and thinking purely allopathically, if that's where you've come from, or if you've been indoctrinated or impressed upon to be focused on the disease. I want us to be able to talk about in common conversation in the future in this industry, the aspects of health that can be focused on so that the body is able to manage the process of chronic disease. So I'm going to get my slideshow shared up here. And we're going to start with Through the Ages Part 3, 60s and beyond. So as a quick recap, we've done this in phases. We've done what I would call the real golden years in inverse. They call the 70s your golden years. I think probably a reference to the Golden Girls, which was a surprisingly fun TV show to watch as a child, even though I didn't understand all the jokes. But we've shifted in society to the point where our health and vitality is the thing that's slipping away from us faster than it ever has before. And then what I highlighted in the 20s and 30s era, if you will, is that the things that most people used to experience in their 40s and 50s are starting to creep into those 20s and 30s. So what does that mean for the 40s and 50s? Well, the things that those experienced in the era we're going to talk about today are now becoming more commonplace during that time frame because in the Western world, we are inundated with stress. We are overexhausted, overextended, under-recovered, and undernourished in many ways, both physically and beyond physically. So that's why we arrive at a place where you have a statistical population of 80% of people in a demographic who are on the path to degeneration. And if they're not there, because chronic disease does not happen overnight, that is where they're arriving at if they don't do something in terms of an intervention, or if we, the clinicians and those that are helping these people with their health, don't become more educated to understand how to intervene properly. So I would like to think that, like certain great movies of our times, some of them might be Oscar winners. I don't think Iron Man or Avengers 3 won an Oscar, but they really were entertaining. My goal is to be somewhere in between the two, and may I have lofty goals for myself and for this lecture? Absolutely, but why aim low in life? So we have talked about this every time because this concept is paramount in understanding this. You have biological age. What is the age of your physiology? You have chronological age. How many birthdays have you had on this planet? And they're not the same thing, and they're likely never perfectly correlated. And if you want to be very accurate, the more very important takeaway is to be healthy, your biological age should be younger than your chronological age. There are a multitude of different ways to measure such things. You can use heart rate rhythm responses, you can use telomere testing, you can use some sort of DNA assessment where you actually look at the SNP issues or the miscodings in one's DNA. But we're getting into a place in life where there is a larger divergence between biological and chronological age, which means that the person who's biologically older than the number of birthdays they've had is on the path to fast degeneration in life. And these things are driven by a host of influences. So they're really about the good behaviors or the positive influences in one's life, be it physiologically, the things that they eat, the things that they do for their body in terms of movement, sleep quality, and then things beyond physiologic that have interface with your physiology, the kind of lights that you have in the house, the kind of frequencies that your body is being exposed to every day. Do you live at a city center? Do you spend a lot of time outside? Are you on your phone at 2 a.m. scrolling through Instagram in bed? These are the negative influences that essentially deplete the body, compromise the adaptability we have, and age us more quickly. Conversely, we have all of the positive influences. Eating well, and that's a very gray term, but let's say eating as nature intended us, not as a supermarket preserve-filled grocery store shelf would intend. How are we moving? How are we exercising? How are we stimulating the positive stress responses in our system to make our bodies healthier and more resilient? Do we prioritize quality sleep, not only in terms of what time we go to bed, but the environment that we sleep in? And then, of course, how do we manage our stress and the overall impacts insidiously given to us through life? Because the average person's nervous system is chronically inundated with an incredible amount of information nowadays. And just simply being overly inundated by information, you can trigger an unconscious stress response that the average person calls normal. They wonder why they're so exhausted at the end of the day. And when they wake up, they feel no more rested, but they got 9 hours of sleep. That's because their body is entering that state where they're spending from their health bank account faster than they're restoring it. So, in terms of the people that we're talking about today, we're talking about the 60s, 70s, 80s, and dare I say 90s. I live in a place where the average age demographic is probably hovering in the low to mid 70s. And if anyone's seen the movie Cocoon, that's what it is I envision for all people in that age category, that they figure out how to feel and be so much younger than they actually are. But the reality is, most of them are chronically ill. My wife works at a private training studio, and there's quite a large space for listed medications on the intake process because the expectation is when someone comes into the facility, they're on at least 1 to 3 medications that the trainers need to be wary of to understand how those things may impact the body negatively. So those are going to be the vast majority of the people we're going to talk about today. And then they subcategorize sometimes because the older generation still comes from a little bit of the old school. What I mean by the old school is the allopathic Western medical system is the most powerful and the only way we do things. But more and more people are starting to wake up to the fact that if you're unwell, a pharmaceutical may manage your symptoms, but it's never going to reverse engineer the problem in the first place. So they want to get healthy a more natural way or a totally natural way, which I love that idea because the body still has regenerative capacities in the sixth and seventh decade of life, albeit just a little bit less so. And then we have a few of these outliers. These are the bionic people. And when I think about this, I think of one of our fearless leaders, Jeff Thurston. Father Time and the Grim Reaper seem to not know about his existence. And there are a few other of those people who, for the life of me, I don't necessarily understand what their secret sauce is, but I think the wisdom in how these people go through their lives, in addition to the fundamentals that we all talk about, nutrition, water quality, supplements, what have you, there's an approach to life, and there's a saying that I've committed to memory because I think it's really impactful. There's aging and there's getting old. They're not necessarily the same thing. And Clint Eastwood always says his secret is he never lets the old man in. And another way to look at that is we get old when we have a deficiency of joy and play. And there's an old saying that says, if you're old and not well, ask yourself the last time you laughed, danced, and sang, because typically when people are not in a good headspace and physical space in life, that's when these things can creep in because it really is a holistic aspect of self. So we're going to revisit this whole aspect of what I decree as my overall approach to how the body regulates itself holistically because energy is everything. So when we have an optimal amount of energy, we typically have a lot of adaptability. That's why when you're 20, you can go out, drink till 3 in the morning, and somehow wake up and get to work at 9 a.m. You might not feel your best, but you can get the job done. Try that in your 50s, it's going to end poorly. Try that in your 70s, that might be the last party you go to, although that is a little morbid. But the reality of everything that I just said is the pattern is as we get older, we have dramatically less adaptability because our recovery capacities are compromised because the body makes less energy overall. Things happen more slowly. So the idea of optimal function to some degree has been compromised and put into a gray zone in terms of how the physiology may be relating to it, because the body's already developed so much compensation simply being alive for 7 decades because of all the insults that that person may have experienced, injuries, surgeries, past issues in terms of health conditions, viral infections, you name it, toxicity accumulation. The longer you've been on this planet, the longer time you have had to reduce your adaptability and thus compromise how you function because you have less energy overall. But not everyone follows the same path. In my research, I was just looking at, people who are athletes in their 80s and such. And the woman on the left at the time of that photo was 80 years old. And this was taken in 2016. And I checked and she's still alive. She's a personal trainer. So she's still working full time. So not only is she in incredible shape, she's probably supercharging her reality because she's loving what she's doing. I don't mean to pick on John Goodman because I think he's a great actor, but he had a massive weight loss recently. And at age 72, I would say he looks 3 decades older than this lady. And if magical weight loss happened in Hollywood, it probably was driven by Ozempic or some kind of GLP-1 like injection. And that's not health. That's a quick fix. And that's probably not going to be something that's going to ensure a high quality of life for him in the long run, but hey, we don't know yet. That stuff's too new. So, what does life beyond the 60s offer us? Well, from a personal psychological perspective, hopefully freedom from most things that cause you stress in your younger years because you've evolved to know who you are so much more. You have so much more time for yourself. And for the person who's on that journey of, shall we call it self-discovery, hopefully, you've achieved some degree of self-mastery of knowing who you are and the development of the personalized habits, if they're positive, that have led you to being healthy in an age where most people are not. There are some challenges, however. The question of time and how much of it we have left is correlated with how much recovery capacity we have, because when someone has less health, they probably have less time. That dovetails into healing potential. Things happen more slowly in an older person's body. By the age of 40, you've probably lost somewhere around 30 to 50% of your mitochondrial density in your cell. And this is the real functional reason why we have less energy as we age and recovery capacity is slower, because our little energy factories we call mitochondria are super densely populated when we're young, and our DNA is so optimally wound and bound that the body has so much energy and recovery capacity. That's why children don't have an off switch. But as we age, each decade after the age of roughly 30, we start to lose muscle mass. We start to compromise our endocrine profiles, meaning our testosterone levels, our growth hormone levels, our insulin sensitivity, our thyroid hormone, all of those things drop, and we lose mitochondrial density. So the amount of electricity moving through our system becomes diminished. So the brightness of our bulb, metaphorically speaking, starts to dim. And then add that to the fact that we're on a planet that has never been more environmentally compromised based upon the amount of chemicals that are in the environment, the quality of the air, the quality of the food we grow, the quality of the water we drink. Well, I shouldn't say we. I should say that the average person who's not necessarily health-minded. So it doesn't really offer a lot in terms of recovery capacity to be supported based upon the average person's habits. And I'm pretty sure this is probably a truth at the age of 60 plus, but it may be a truth at the age of 30 if you went for Indian food the night before. I don't know. I was going to use a different meme here, but I'm glad I stuck with this one because I think this one walks that line perfectly. So last lecture I introduced this, and this is kind of taking a high level view of understanding patterns of how chronic disease might be generated or catalyzed within the body. It's really about the sum of all physiologic stressors. What I mean by the sum of is the total amount in terms of quantity and the individual influence of that stress. Those two things added together impressed upon the person in terms of how much, how long, and what variables, i.e., the perfect storm, until that person starts to present symptoms. After they present symptoms over a given time, those symptoms are early warning signs that if they're addressed, the person might be able to change their course or correct the course that they're currently on. But the reality of all of these things that are ever increasing in terms of their stressful influence is typically what aggregates to create the disease presentation outcome. And what I mean by disease presentation outcome is if you pick a chronic condition, you can insert said chronic condition and likely reverse engineer that person's chronic condition to whatever specific variables from this list added themselves together in that person's life that ultimately created that outcome. And the reason I like this model is it shows you that A, disease is very, very complicated because we still know far less about the development of disease than we know more about, meaning we still don't know how true autoimmunity develops. We have no idea the actual root causative factors of cancer and cardiovascular issues, but we know certain hallmarks. We know certain presentations and certain aggregations of variables, i.e., the results of a blood test, the results of a biochemical analysis, a biometric analysis. But if we start thinking practically, we need to also think about what the person's gone through and what they're going through perpetually so we can then connect the dots for their individual case. Because we have to think cellularly in terms of really understanding chronic disease. Why? Because the body is a very intricate and complex composition of multiple cell types. And each cell at the fundamental base requires the same things. Every cell needs oxygen because without oxygen, there is no life. Hold your breath for as long as you can. Something will force you to breathe because your body is losing the ability to absorb oxygen and offload carbon dioxide. We need water. Without water, we cannot conduct electricity, and making energy in the body is really about conducting electricity. We need the basic raw materials of macronutrients, glucose, amino acids, and fatty acids, and then we need our micronutrients. And these things, under conditions of a healthy cell, are taken in and they're used to build new molecules and new structure so that cell can live on and continue to contribute its specific functions to the overall health of an organism. And all of these things are delivered within an optimal environment internally. And then because nutrition and food comes in, waste materials have to go out. And if that is able to be maintained in any cell in the body, it doesn't matter what cell that organ is comprised of, that's going to give that organ a chance to be healthy. So what does that look like? A healthy endothelial cell in an artery is going to have the ability to maintain proper flexibility so that those arteries can expand and contract. A healthy cell in the gut lining is going to be able to optimally pull nutrition into the bloodstream and transport that where it needs to go. A healthy liver cell is going to help to contribute the enzyme production to liver detoxification so that person's body can maintain an optimal state of health, not being too backed up with toxicity. But through the process of chronicity, this simple process, this simple balance sheet, if you will, this yin yang, this anabolic catabolic pathway gets dysregulated, and we see a change from what a healthy cell looks like to an unhealthy cell. And there are a few hallmarks that are quite interesting. Most people don't know that an unhealthy cell has a different cell membrane voltage, meaning the quantity of conducted electricity moving through the cell is lower. And most people don't know, or maybe they do, but it surprises most people when I tell them that when you drop below 30 millivolts, that's the electrical charge potential of a cancer cell. So what happens? The entire structure of the cell changes because the function of the cell changes. When it stops being able to detoxify waste because it's not provided enough energy, wastes accumulate. So the cell becomes more rigid, the water becomes less structured, and the internal environment of the cell becomes dirty and compromised, and less nutrients get in. Therefore, the quality of the mitochondria in the cell become compromised because rather than making energy in the presence of oxygen, they start to make energy in the presence of no oxygen. So they ferment, they lower the pH of the cell, and the cell becomes acidic and anaerobic. And very shortly after, that cell will probably die prematurely. Whereas a healthy cell is the exact opposite manifestation of that. There's a beautiful inflow and outflow. There's a permeable fluid membrane. The internal environment is clean. It's a little microcosm all in and of itself. And the energy in that cell is of a high conductivity So there's an efficient flow of information because energy and information are really synonyms when it comes to physiology. But what does this mean practically? Because you can't tell the average person, well, your cellular charge is low and your membranes aren't permeable because they're going to look at you like you have three heads. So what I did is I tried to come up with a way of explaining how this process may start. By no means is this absolute, but I see these things in a lot of the chronic cases that I've dealt with because we have to make things practical in the body. So high stress. I've capitalized that because stress is the original thing that throws the body off, and I'll call it stress from multiple origins, drives disruption in cellular behavior systemically. When the body's under stress, it does not perform its best. It enters survival mode to try to adapt to the stress. And if it doesn't have adaptation capabilities, when we start to see changes. So you have a re-regulation from stress, usually through the nervous system, and that creates oxygen carrying deficiencies, oxygen delivery deficiencies, and specifically when that happens in the brain loses its ability to have its critical thinking higher functions intact, and it goes back toward a more lizard brain way of surviving, which is why typically highly stressed or sick people are also highly emotionally reactive and they can't think logically or very clearly. If that process is sustained, we start to experience what's called neuroendocrine function. It's a fancy way of saying that stress response feedback system from the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenals has to chronically pump out adrenaline and stress hormones to deal with that pattern. And an insidious thing that happens is you start to get functional respiratory changes, so the person doesn't breathe well. When the person doesn't breathe well, they don't oxygenate, but they also don't regulate the communication among the gut-brain axis. When that happens, you usually see chronic immune stress because the body's on high alert. So the immune system is the one system in the body that's designed to detect all the potential threats. And if that's happening, typically the gut becomes a little bit more leaky, a little bit more reactive, and the person can develop a chronic low-grade systemic inflammation, or that inflammation can potentially show up specifically in a specific organ or a specific tissue, possibly accompanied with a reactivation or an accumulation of biotoxic wastes. All of those things will lead to metabolic disruption. And a very important thing that's not spoken about a lot in health is a shift in body composition in conjunction with systemic endocrine issues. Less muscle mass, sarcopenia, more accumulation of adipose tissue, body fat, and then a dysregulation of things like testosterone levels, growth hormone, some of the previously mentioned hormones. So signaling is compromised in the body. And if this happens over the long term, the body's in energy resource utilization mode, which compromises the digestive system, as we've all talked about, which compromises nutrient breakdown, nutritional delivery, and a body that's producing more metabolic waste, which doesn't have the energy to detoxify itself, that also needs more energy that it can't bring in. This is happening on a microcycle inside of a cell, all the way to the macro, the entire organism, that entire person, and they will experience this as feeling like absolute crap. So if this process percolates for 3 to 5 decades, which it takes that long to happen, the human body is wonderfully adaptable, but eventually it does wave the white flag. This person will have a diseased state, or they will be a diseased individual who's presenting an illness pattern. And this is why chronic disease is sometimes like playing a game of whack-a-mole because no two chronic diseases that have been given the same name were developed or occurred in the exact same way, but there are commonalities in terms of how the bodies chose to compensate. And I will let you look at this little statistic right here that I did mention before, and also look at the last part because body consciousness or the awareness to the person is something that the medical system really hasn't emphasized because the body did not develop this chronic condition by accident. All of the compensation mechanisms and the presentation of symptoms were conscious decisions by the body to adapt to an inhospitable environment internally, which means the terrain of the body, the gut terrain, the mucosal linings, the matrix between the cells, essentially are all dirty and compromised. And usually when you see that, you see an externally compromised environment or terrain, a mold-filled house, excessive EMF stress, some kind of chemical environmental poisoning. Any of those things have the ability to reflect patterns internally and externally. And this is why I believe we have the statistics that we do, because we've normalized these things as a society. And the unfortunate reality is you get to the point where you're managing your symptoms with pharmaceuticals, which do have an effect to help manage the symptom and provide the person some degree of relief, but there's no root causative reverse engineering in there because they developed this as a result of habitual negative lifestyle influences and impulses. And it doesn't have to happen. But since most people are really not in the know of themselves, or they don't understand their habits and how going to the grocery store and shopping from the middle aisles where all the packaged foods are primarily, and having your shopping cart filled with Coke or Pepsi products, they don't know that's bad for them. So they unfortunately feel like a victim of their own circumstance, looking for someone else to save them. I think we all need to take a certain degree of personal responsibility, but the clinicians who are wanting to help people understand health, not the further study of disease, this needs to be communicated, in my opinion, because there's really two major approaches when dealing with chronic disease. If the person has the capability, they have the will, they have the discipline, the determination, and the belief, you can reverse chronic disease, but it's not an easy thing because the practitioner and the person who's involved in the process both have to go on this journey together. The other aspect is if you're dealing with someone who's had chronic issues for many years, the therapeutic and strategic use of supplements and natural health products and other modalities that are supportive and conducive to being piggybacked in terms of, using diet and therapeutic nutrition and supplementation can help slow or halt the progress of the nature of an illness presentation. That's really what I want to talk about today with our core focus products and all of the other products that I did list in terms of how they can plug themselves into the chronic care model. And we're going to start with Trubifido. Being a digestive wellness company, this is the thing that we do better than anyone else, in my opinion. I'm sure Jeff and Jeff would agree with me because why wouldn't they? This is their life's work. What we can offer from a perspective of probiotics is a great place to start with potentially no causative or collateral damage in the beginning. What I mean by that is sometimes a probiotic for someone who's very compromised can be too much of a stress for their system to manage because the probiotic that they're using has no known functionalities, no known details of how it interacts with the immune system, or the person who's selected it has not done enough research to understand what strains of probiotic bacteria might be better given certain circumstances that are presented, immune activation, autoimmunity, chronic low-grade inflammation, things of that nature. So using True Bifido as a starting point is fantastic because Bifido are very calming. They're also a keystone strain. They're some of the earliest colonizers, and they're some of the most fragile organisms because the average person who has some sort of chronic condition, more often than not, has likely had multiple exposures to antibiotics that might have wiped out their endogenous Bifido populations in the first place. So multiple strains of Bifido with sodium alginate and lactostim to ensure A, deep delivery, B, functionality of waking those probiotics up so they have the maximal opportunity to colonize. Using the strain designations, we've made sure that this product only has the ability to interact with the immune system in a very specific way. And I would say that way would be calming because the immune system uses cytokines to direct activity in the body. So a pro-inflammatory cytokine directs a white blood cell to rally the troops to attack something. An anti-inflammatory cytokine helps to calm things down if there has been some degree of upregulated activity. In some cases, to get someone out of a crisis situation, or if their digestive system is really compromised, using a anti-inflammatory producing strain or multitude of strains might help that person get out of crisis. And because these are the ketone strains, without the sodium alginate and the lactostim, getting these probiotics into the colon, which this is a colon-specific formula, becomes less and less potentially viable because, again, Bifido is a very fragile organism. So this is the starting point if someone doesn't know where to start as a clinician with their elderly populations, because if you have someone who's got a fungal, dysbiotic, bacterial overgrowth, putting in a lactobacillus or something that's got a little bit more of an anti-organismic action to it might cause a reaction where their immune system may not be so tolerant of it. It might not, but I'm of the mind to say start more gently and then progress the person as you build up that adaptability that we talked about until their body's ready to clean house. And then we have Natozyme, and we're going to talk about Natozyme and Lumberzyme directly after because we've often been asked about these. We've compared them, and since, a certain time frame in life, the rise of cardiovascular issues has really been an important topic of conversation. And if there's one thing that's probably true of most people in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, is that they do have some degree of arterial plaquing or cardiovascular blockage. It's actually true of people in their 30s and 40s, but no one gets checked until it's really too much of a problem. So nattokinase is one of the best agents for that that's been used long held in Eastern countries like Japan for a cardiovascular preventative strategy, i.e., you're taking nattokinase or eating something like fermented natto as a lifestyle choice for its health benefits. Because trust me, no one eats natto because it's delicious or visually appealing. Some people don't like the fact that it's derived from soy. What's really interesting about ours is even though it is derived from soy, it is a soy-free product and its end result. So if someone does have a soy allergy or some sort of disdain for that raw material, we can promise that there is no soy, but we've also added catalase and astrazyme, which no other product on the market that's a nattokinase has, for the upregulation of the enzyme activity and for catalase's ability to act as an antioxidant to not only protect the enzyme from any sort of degenerative action in the body, but to give the body a little bit of an antioxidant boost. How nattokinase works most specifically is it does two things in the body in relationship to the cardiovascular system. First and foremost, it targets this protein buildup called fibrin. So the buildup of plaque in the arteries, which we've talked about, is quite poorly understood by the average person, especially if they think cholesterol is still the problem. High cholesterol is a symptom of cardiovascular inflammation, and in the buildup of plaque, which happens underneath the arterial lining, the fibrin protein is part of the incorporation into plaque. And typically, when someone is doing such things, their blood viscosity becomes thicker, less like water, a little bit more like syrup. So, the positive influence that something like nattokinase and lumbrokinase has on arterial plaque dissolution is it can target that fibrin protein, which initiates the breakdown and helps the immune system break down plaque more efficiently because enzymes work with the endogenous enzymes in the body and also the immune system to take energy requirements away from the immune system doing all the job. In conjunction with lowering blood viscosity and improving the blood thinning properties, which pairs very nicely with something like an essential fatty acid, a fish oil, or a vitamin E, when your blood's viscous, it cannot deliver oxygen and nutrients effectively to the cells that need it. So you want blood to flow like water. You never want it to flow like syrup. Trust me, I lived in Canada. On a cold day, starting a car is a very, very stressful thing because of how cold the oil gets. You don't want that to ever be happening inside of your body due to the fact that your blood viscosity is becoming too thick. The difference between nattokinase and lumbrokinase is most importantly the source, whereas nattokinase is derived from soy. Lumbrokinase is actually our only non-vegan product, which is derived from a silkworm, a worm species. It's the excretion of a worm, which sounds really gross when I say it out loud. So for those who are sensitive to vegan products, technically this one is not vegan sourced, but it still doesn't mean that it's any less or more effective. It's just a different way of targeting that same mechanism in the body through slightly different means of how the enzyme works. Like nattokinase, it is paired with catalase and astrazyme. The only main difference is in some research articles that I've read, nattokinase has been said to be potentially contraindicated to those who are using blood thinning medications, whereas there is no correlation with lumberzyme having that same contraindication. So if you want to support someone who is on a warfarin or a Coumadin, a blood thinning medication, and they want something natural that also has benefits to helping the plaque dissolve within the system, this might be a better choice. You can also switch back and forth because even though we don't necessarily have all the research, I do think that these enzymes do things beyond what's currently elucidated because that's usually how science works. They figure something out 20 years after the thing's been in the marketplace. But lumberzyme may also have some biofilm disrupting activity, which may lend itself to positive aspects of helping the digestive system clean house if someone wants to do something like gut cleansing. And now we're going to look at more condition and mechanism specific products. And these are going to be potentially repeated from some of the last aspects because just because we're talking about a 60 and a 70-year-old, it doesn't mean you can't use products like these when you're in your 20s or in your 40s. They just may have a different focal point given the circumstances that are presented. Immune nutrition is a big thing. The average person, especially if their digestive system isn't working, if they don't have adequate gallbladder function or adequate pancreatic function, typically is deficient in fat-soluble nutrients, vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, and K. Now, while there is no E in here, there's a very high dose of vitamin A in its optimal form, a therapeutic dose of vitamin D, and vitamin K, which if someone doesn't eat leafy green vegetables, they're probably missing because vitamin K has a twofold role. One, helping to incorporate calcium into tissues as K1. K2 helps to take calcium out of soft tissues where it's not meant to be. But this is paired with metabolism enhancing antioxidants in the form of EGCG from green tea and alpha lipoic acid, which are both not only antioxidants, but they help improve metabolic signaling, specifically around energy metabolism inside the cell. And there is also a probiotic strain in here that's specifically been selected to focus on what this product's main goal is, and it's to induce T regulatory function. And what Treg function is the adaptive immune system's ability to not perpetually be stimulated in a pro-inflammatory response. T regulatory cells help bring down that overactive immune system. And by virtue of doing that, it also helps to manage oxidative stress through the Treg induction, but because there are certain nutrients that lend themselves very well to being powerful antioxidants. The final thing is the positive influence on overall metabolic health and gut inflammation, because nutritional deficiencies, antioxidant deficiencies, and dysbiosis are all hallmarks that most people who have chronic degenerative conditions share as drivers of whatever created their long-term issue. And we haven't talked about Czyme yet, and I think Czyme is a very underutilized and underappreciated enzyme. It's not very popular in North America, but in Asia, it's actually a prescriptive agent. I was going to say medication, but it's not a medication. But in some cases, you do need a prescription because those with respiratory illness like COPD or chronic pulmonary issues will use Czyme as an effective intervention. And our Czyme is an incredibly high crystal structure, high purity crystal structure. So it's hard to find a really high quality source of Czyme. And what we try to do is maximize its efficacy. So we pair the C-Pros S with Astrozyme to ensure that the enzyme has an adequate mineral reserve to catalyze the activity of that enzyme because every enzyme needs a mineral as a cofactor, kind of like a lock and key mechanism. What CSIME does is it targets specifically the respiratory mucosal lining, but that may extend to other mucosal linings because anywhere in the body where there's an orifice or an opening, a mucosal lining exists to entrap things that the body wants to keep out of specific general circulation inside of the cells and tissues. So if someone has chronic respiratory issues, they've been exposed to black mold, they've been a smoker, they've had smoke inhalation from some sort of crisis event, sometimes those people can't properly clear those infections. And inflammation in the mucosal lining can then lead to an infection being harbored, to which the inflammatory proteins end up being the target of C-Pros, which help to break down those inflammatory proteins in conjunction with the immune system, manage the irritation, and hopefully help clear up the microbiome of the respiratory lining of the lung, which has the ability to influence the systemic microbiome of the body. The microbiome of the gut, although is the granddaddy in terms of the body, there's an oral microbiome, there's a nasal microbiome, there's a respiratory microbiome. Anywhere there is a mucosal lining, there's a buildup or a collection of bacteria. And if one is compromised, it will communicate or potentially translocate to all others because the lungs are the interface of oxygenating the blood. The entire amount of the blood circulates through the lungs every couple minutes in the body. So that's an important area of the body to keep clean. And ever since, the last 5 years, making sure that our respiratory systems are healthy, is especially paramount. And now we're moving on to something that's a little bit more detoxification or antioxidant focused. We talked about this in the 20s and 30s webinar, where it was more on dealing with phase two liver detoxification, whereas today I'm going to talk about it as more of an antioxidant regulator and in some cases can be used as a detoxification agent, but there are some considerations that we might want to think through before we make that decision for an elderly person. Sulfurazyme is really a high quality and pure stabilized sulforaphane, which is broccoli sprout extract. Typical products in the marketplace have to combine two ingredients in order to activate the sulforaphane. Ours is already done for you. So the purity and the efficacy, i.e., the effects in the body, are going to be a lot better because there's going to be less waste and attrition for that biochemical reaction needing to happen after the ingredients have been ingested. Add that to the astrazyme, and this becomes a very powerful inducer of two main effects in the body. First is it is the master antioxidant stimulator. So the body has this pathway that when is it's under chronic inflammation gets upregulated. It's called the NF-kappa B pathway. And the quick and dirty of that is it teaches the body to be better at raising inflammation to deal with the insult and the signal that the body's being sent and is receiving. So if you think about it, if you roll an ankle, the body swells the ankle up. That's a good thing because immobilizing the ankle is going to be the initial catalyzing to that ankle healing. If you have an infection, if you have some sort of driver of inflammation in the body, the necessary response of the body is to upregulate inflammation because it's the immune system that ends up helping to deal with that problem. You want that to happen. But if the body cannot resolve that inflammatory insult because it's been stuck in that pattern for too long, then sometimes you need to push the counter-regulatory mechanism up more so, which is the NRF2 pathway, which is the master antioxidant response stimulator in the body, meaning all of our internal antioxidant responses, i.e., the enzymes that are created, are generated by this NRF2 pathway being increased or upregulated to help silence the systemic inflammation in the body. The other thing that sulforaphane does really well is it's a stimulator of a couple of the phase two liver detox pathways, specifically the sulfation pathway and the methylation pathway. Detoxification is a very complex topic, and detoxifying someone who is, beyond the age of 60, I would say is an art because there are certain aspects that need to be checked off before you want to give them the stimulators of the detox process. You have to make sure the channels are open, you have to make sure you know what you're going after, and you have to develop an ironclad and well-defined protocol to make sure that you're not going to give that person a stressful reaction. So this could be something that could be quite powerful for someone who's a little bit more gently inclined with how compromised their body might be. But it could also be a really good thing for people who have chronic hormone detox issues, chronic environmental toxicity exposures. Stimulating the phase two liver detox enzymes can be something that can help resolve that accumulation of chronic toxicity within the body. And we have youthzyme. Youthzyme is not often spoken about because not a lot of people really dig superoxide dismutase. And I think, in this population, this might be one of the most important products, not just because the word youth is in the title. Superoxide dismutase, catalase, alpha lipoic acid, and astrazyme. That's like the quartet of super powerful antioxidant enzymes and or stimulators of antioxidant responses in the body. Superoxide dismutase and catalase work together as part of the body's internal antioxidant, endogenous antioxidant enzyme system. So they basically take some of the most gnarly free radicals and pro-oxidants and they detoxify them into something that's quite harmless so the body doesn't have to deal with the acute exposure to those free radicals. Alpha lipoic acid also works quite well because it is an antioxidant nutrient and also a metabolic enhancing nutrient. And astrazyme makes everything work better and more powerfully. So, functionally speaking, in the body, what this does, superoxide dismutase specifically targets hydrogen peroxide. And hydrogen peroxide can be one of those very nefarious peroxidants because it can cause a whole host of damage. It's a key part of the antioxidant enzyme system, as I mentioned, because superoxide dismutase, catalase, and glutathione peroxidase are all meant to work in conjunction to make sure that the antioxidant capacity of a cell or a tissue or an organ is up to snuff. And typically speaking, people who are under chronic stress deplete these three antioxidant enzymes. So what ends up happening is if their exposure doesn't reduce, but their capacity to manage the oxidative response does, that person essentially rusts from the inside faster. But the rusting is a metaphor for how their system degrades and could be a potential catalyst to accelerating the path into chronic degeneration. And that pairs really well with Sun Spectrum, another one of our products that, because it's not sun fiber, gets overlooked. Sun Spectrum has all the benefits of sun fiber, but it pairs curcumin, coenzyme Q10 in very specific, highly absorbable and utilizable forms, and bifidolactis, which again can be one of those calming strains to the digestive system, because this product really was developed to help people who are going through severe digestive issues, things like IBDs, Crohn's, colitis, and also for cancer treatments, because in certain cases, when people are going through certain strategies to address cancer, some of the interventions cause an incredible amount of damage to the digestive system because digestive cells are the fastest replicating cells in the body. So what that person will need is all the gut support they possibly can to potentially deal with some existing or pre-existing gut inflammation, but also to feed the microbes to potentially rebuild their endogenous microbiome, because there's a lot of things that unfortunately people have to take that, although they're not a direct target and they're not necessarily wanting to do this, it compromises otherwise healthy areas of the body because the entire organism is affected. So you have the ability to modulate the immune system with the antioxidant properties. And for therapeutic gut issues, sunfiber is a really good selection because it doesn't feed any pathogenic microbes and it's very gentle and non-irritating, unlike some other soluble and insoluble fibers, which can create a negative internal environment for someone who's in a very fragile and compromised state. I'd be remiss if I didn't put an HCl zyme. Very simple product, but very effective product. Hydrochloric acid or betaine hydrochloride specifically, plus astrazyme to make that HCl more effective in terms of its potency. Why HCl is so important for people as they age is our digestive system weakens over time with less energy, which probably makes sense in the lead up of what it was I was speaking about today. If the stomach becomes more alkaline, a multitude of bad things happen in the body. Number one, the internal environment of the stomach, the mucosal lining changes. Number two, the opportunity for opportunistic pathogens in the stomach or from food to get into the small and large intestine becomes more possible. Number three, we compromise the digestive system if the stomach's acid is not acidic enough. You want it to be around a pH of somewhere between 2 to 3. And the most important thing is we compromise our ability to nourish our bodies because people need more net protein as they age to offset the effects of sarcopenia. Sarcopenia is age-related muscle loss. So the average person over the age of 60 needs to ensure that their protein digestion is optimized because their body needs those raw materials to rebuild new cellular structures. If they're not breaking down their proteins properly, it's a matter of time until they create dysbiosis, which is a driver of chronic issues, but they also won't be able to be taking in the raw materials to rebuild things and offset the degradation that chronic degeneration creates inside the body. That was quite a tongue twister to say. And then we have chlorozyme, another one of our incredible products. The more you research it, the more you really are quite amazed at what algae can do for the human body. It's like this was put here for good use for us, but we had to discover it. So you have nutrition, you have detoxification support, and you have binding capabilities. Binding in the context of helping the body to get things out of the digestive system, moving the toxicity through the bowels, which is still one of the most fundamental things that we can do for ourselves in terms of maintaining health. Cracked cell wall chlorella, a very high source of very easy to absorb amino acids, proteins, but also a high quantity of micronutrients and trace minerals, really used in Japan as one of the go-to things when there was a bunch of radiation exposure when Fukushima happened. So very interesting that it can help protect our DNA. Spirulina is even more so nutritious in terms of the vitamins, minerals, and amino acids it contains, as is clam and flake algae, which is a lake in Oregon that basically, if you've ever taken E3 Live, that's essentially what that stuff is. So you have all of these different blue-green algae donating all of the superfood nutrition that they have, plus the fact that we added in probiotics, all organically sourced. Not the probiotics, the food, but I guess the probiotics could technically be organically sourced. So what you're doing here is you're giving yourself easy to digest, easy to absorb, high quality nutrition with nutrients that you will not find anywhere else. So this can be taken as a nutritional supplement. You're also using these trace minerals for potential detoxification support as a stimulator. So if someone is using a cleanzyme or sulfurazyme, I like pairing the chlorozyme with those two because of how it helps to support both axes of working on the gut and working on what the body's trying to increase the speed of processing and releasing. And because these things act like a binder, they can help escort things out of the body more readily because when it comes to detox, the adage is always better out than staying in. And the Hedron glass is where I want to finish today because we talked about this last time. This generation is becoming more and more friendly with technology. What I mean by that is I know my family members, my wife's family members, other people who their hobby in the evening is being on their iPad, being on their phone, scrolling through Facebook, making weird comments on people's photos. This group has embraced technology, but they have not become as mindful of how that technology is affecting them in a negative way. Why I'm saying this is your circadian rhythm, your cortisol, melatonin regulation is even more important after the age of 60 because it's likely to assume that this process has been somewhat dysregulated from the quantity of time that you've been on this planet. And one way to keep the body in healthy long-term operation is to anchor the circadian rhythm of the body. That means morning light exposure in the evening and blocking artificial light exposure in the afternoon afterwards. Morning light exposure, sorry, in the morning is going to help increase and regulate the cortisol rhythm. Blocking evening light exposure, artificial light specifically before bed, is going to help anchor that melatonin response, which is going to help the body repair and recover more optimally during sleep. And it's going to make sleep more restful in quality in spite of the number of hours someone gets. Last time I checked, that might be an important thing for someone who's over the age of 60 if they want to wake up and feel good and go dominate the pickleball court. So, as with all of these lectures, I do always want to reiterate that health is holistic. The difference between an acute issue and a chronic issue is basically the body's inability to resolve it. And the chronic issues that I believe people are experiencing and are expressing are conscious decisions by their bodies to not only get their attention, but to deal with what it is that they have not discovered about how they're living, the way they're living, and to become more mindful and more responsible for their own health. We've talked about this a lot. An organ works as part of an organ system, and when it's compromised, it cannot contribute to the critical functions of the network of the body. The body, as an organism, is a group of organs, which is an organ system, which is a combination of specialized tissues, each organ having its unique combination of tissues. But at the end of the day, a tissue is nothing more than a group of cells. So even though some specific areas of the body might need support, I really, really want to pass along the insights and the perspectives that we always want to think about the whole person to treat them as a being to maintain their optimal state of health. And by no means is this the final perspective or the specific way to address anything. I do love learning new things from some of our practitioners about how they use products and how they've had successes with products outside potentially the predetermined boundaries where that product is thought to exist. But these are guidelines of how to use products in specific ways or under specific conditions and approaches. And with that, I want to thank everyone. It was a lot of fun for me to put this one together. I think I enjoyed this one the most just because it resonates in my heart the most because of the state of the world that we're dealing with. I see a ton of people who are struggling through life, and unfortunately, it's out of ignorance. They don't know where to go next because they've been failed by something they thought was going to help them. And it's up to us to be the guiding lights, not only as clinicians, but if you are a health-minded person yourself, share this with anyone who might want to watch it, and we can take a little bit of time for some questions. So again, thank you very much. I will take a sip of water. I love when I end exactly at 5:59, well, Eastern time.
That was timed out, Roland. Can you hear me yet?
Oh, the chat's disabled, right? I got into the flow and I forgot about that. Well, if you
Um,
do have any questions, guys, you can by all means email in, shoot any messages in.
I think, Roland, you can't hear me,
I'm gonna read Jeff's
but
lips here because I have not practiced my sign language.
um,
Right, so the attendees can hear. Okay, so if you guys do have any questions, by all means.
yeah, there's the Q&A feature is
Oh,
working.
so I'm
I just
gonna
want to
try to
let
reiterate
Roland
this one
know
more
that
time.
you
Oh, the
can
Q&A
submit
is working. Okay.
questions. You can submit questions through the Q&A feature if there happens to be any. Otherwise, email is working too. So sorry
Technical
for the.
difficulties make everything so much easier, don't they? Well, guys, I will
Yes.
say that we will be shifting gears next month. We're going to focus on travel, things that one can think about, plan for, prepare for, and hopefully address if something goes wrong during travel. And then we're going to do a back to school feature, things to keep the immune system of your children and the whole household healthy. Because there's nothing like when one of your kids brings home something that was passed around at school and the whole family's down for the weekend in pajamas, watching Netflix, dribbling from their noses. So I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to put this together. I hope it was impactful for you all. We'll see you guys next month. Bye, Jeff. Bye, everyone. Take care. See you soon.